Good morning. This is World History video number 1, Between the Wars. When World War I ended, the United States returned to isolationism. You have 3 Republican presidents, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. They allowed industry to develop and to use laissez-faire during this period of time, meaning industry did pretty much what they wanted to do. When the war ended, you had a brief shutdown in the economy. This is when soldiers returned from war and factories that had government contracts, they had to shift from wartime production to consumer goods. Also, the women that worked during World War I, oftentimes they left the industry and went back home and they married and started families. Now, during the 1920s, you have a growth of industry. You have assembly lines. Henry Ford is not the innovator of the assembly line. He's not the developer of the assembly line, but he's the one who improves it to make it be able to work. What does he produce? He produces the Model T, which is referred to often as the Tin Lizzie. Okay, Ford's workers were the highest paid workers of this era. They earned $5 a day. And they pretty much had their own union. And speaking of unions, anybody who wanted to unionize, oftentimes they were fired in industry. Number 2, also at the end of World War I, you had the rise of the Red Scare. Russia becomes a communist country, the Soviet Union. We were fearful in this country that we would see all of these Reds come in and want to take over our democracy. That's when Mitchell Palmer begins to round up people that he suspects of being Reds. He had no concrete evidence whatsoever that these people were communist. Also, you have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, most people think of the Ku Klux Klan as being in the South. No, the Ku Klux Klan was not in the South. The Ku Klux Klan was in the South, but it was not just solely in the South. You had large numbers, more in this region than you're going to have in the South, and that's going to be Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Kansas. What was their purpose? They wanted to get rid of immigrants. They wanted to get rid of Jews. They wanted to get rid of Catholics. Why? Because these foreigners were coming in and taking American jobs. Okay? So this is a time of nativism. Why did the Klan begin to lose its popularity and its membership? Most people in the 1920s that had a job or wanted a job had a job. So unemployment would be extremely low. And you had to find someone who was willing to come in and take these low-paying jobs that most Americans did not want during this period of time, okay? Also during this period of time, you have the change in the role of women. Women began to stay in the workforce. They realized they needed to cut their hair, and also they began to change their dress. They wore shorter dresses that went to their knee at this particular point in time. The hairstyle was referred to as a bob. Now, one of the things you were asked to do was to explain the role of women in 2 words. Yes, one of them would be independence, because yes, women received the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. First time. Now, in addition to this, women also began to be called flappers. That was a term that you should have used, flappers, F-L-A-P-P-E-R-S. Why? Because the women wore pumps. They wore nylon hose to work. And as they were walking down the street, particularly in New York where they have awnings that would overhang, water would fall off, rain would fall off, and their legs would get wet with the nylon. So they would wear what I would term overshoes that they would put over their pumps. They would be like little boots that they would wear over their pumps to work. And instead of hooking them, they had one little button on the side that they would hook. Instead of doing that, the women would come down the street and those overshoes would flap, and so that's where they got the name flappers from during this point in time. The economy grows. People have jobs. Now, the industry that was sick in the 1920s was agriculture. Farmers were producing as if they were still trying to feed the world during World War I. Farmers didn't make much money this year, so they decided they have to plant more crops, when in reality, they needed to go back to cutting what they were producing, but they didn't want to because they were afraid that they wouldn't make enough money. So that put farmers in debt. Okay, they had to borrow money to keep their farms going during this period of time. That's going to be the sick industry. Consumers overspent. They were bombarded by new inventions that they needed. The Model T, radios, electric appliances, electric fans, electric vacuum cleaners, carpet cleaners at this period of time. And so consumers overspent. For the first time, they began to buy things on credit. That's the way they started buying cars, was where you make a payment on your car, similar to what your parents do today. Also at this point in time, you had workers that were working in factories and stores, and they were consumed with trying to get ahead of other people. So therefore, stores gave them credit. The credit was based upon the fact that you had a job. They weren't worried how many other credits did you have. The stock market grew. This was like playing the lottery at this period of time. Newspapers had stories every week about people that had become rich through the stock market. You know, they didn't have to work. So people were playing the stock market. That's what it was. It was a gamble on the stock market. They bought stock. They didn't have money to pay for the stock. That's known as buying on the margin. You bought the stock from your stockbroker. By Friday, you had to pay your loan off, plus you were hoping to make money. If you weren't able to pay your loan off, then you were in financial trouble. This is World History Video number 1, Between the Wars.